and just in time for people to not give a damn. Awesome. I could never help but exercise a bit of curiosity in regards to how receptive people would end up being to a game like Blasphemous, especially in this current environment where everyone seems quick to send out a parade of magic yellow circles towards any channel that dares utter the naughty fuck word, and I know I'm guilty of that at least 20 times a video, and no, I don't know how I'm still afloat, but don't worry, because given my recent track record, something tells me my time is it's right around the corner. That said, for all those reasons, I kinda am glad to see Blasphemous had a pretty successful release. I don't know, it just seemed like one of those games where all the conditions were primed for it to fail, you know? Heavily offensive, bloody content paired up with a platform growing increasingly intolerant to anything you wouldn't be able to show on the goddamn Disney Channel. If this were some high-profile title from a AAA developer, it would have fallen to the ground and split its head open on a fence post on the way down. Despite Blasphemous spitting in the face of just about every mainstream censorship guideline I can think of, not only is this a great game with a great art style to look at and lose your mind over, but also a really great and satisfying game that I'll admit did successfully scratch my Silksong itch for a few days. And I'll also go ahead and admit that certainly was not what I was expecting from it. When I first saw the trailer, Blasphemous was one of those weird anomalies where you aren't completely sure if it's your style or not, but it's way too suggestive and bloody for it not to offend someone, so you still want to follow it just for the entertainment of seeing how people handle it. And I'm actually really glad I did, because as it turns out, the art style actually wasn't the only thing in the game that managed to keep me playing. So in the spirit of a game defying mainstream expectations and in efforts to keep the yellow symbol gods as appeased as possible, I'm going to offset all the gore and suggestive themes by giving you a completely family-friendly PG-rated review with as little profanity as possible. And if you're a regular viewer, you already know how ridiculous that sounds coming from me, and you're giving me about 3 minutes to go and mess it up. Truth be told, I enjoyed the game. Like, I really enjoyed the game. But the idea of actually sitting down and giving it a review never really occurred to me until, as per usual, some of the industry's great gaming journalist personalities started funneling all these 6s and 7s down the internet pipeline. And I don't know, while I'd be hard-pressed to say Blasphemous is some perfect side-scroller to end all side-scrollers, I'd be just as bothered giving it a freaking 7, and anyone that places this game below a 7, in my humble opinion, need to back the F word off, cause I don't give a darn. Jesus Christ, this might actually be the first bit I do that gives me an aneurysm. The setting of the game takes place in the town of Custodia, a Revelations-esque depiction of what it would be like if the Old Testament was illustrated by Junji Ito and then thrown into a blender. Many of the custodians, and no, that's not a joke, the game literally just calls them that. Many of the custodians seem to push everything else but eating and sleeping to the back seat to make room for exercising penance to absolve themselves of their sins in preparation for the end of times. The way the backstory is laid out takes the Soulsy approach of hiding most of the plot in item descriptions and random dialogue interactions that wouldn't otherwise make sense if you didn't bother to go and look for them. The items, relics, and various trinkets you pick up serve to unravel the meat of the story and drive the plot forward. Their descriptions often have hidden details of a specific scene from the game's past where everything quite literally went to hell in a handbasket. And bear in mind the word hidden being used there is a pretty loose fit, because these plot points are about as hidden as just about everything else in the game. There's literally a button you can press in the menu over every single item you collect that just says lore. Like, yep, there's the story, there it is. But honestly, even so much as running through the TLDR of the overarching plot would in and of itself probably take like 10 minutes. So for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to spare you the exposition and leave it at, if you're someone who enjoys looking for a game story as much as you do reliving the Adventist trauma of childhood religious indoctrination, then well, here you go, Chief. This is the game for you. The gameplay itself is just about everything you're used to seeing from your average two-dimensional Metroid Hollow Cells hack-and-slash Vania Verge Symphony of the Souls-like. It's about as challenging as you'd expect, but the controls are designed tightly enough to make that sort of gameplay more enjoyable than it is obnoxious. Although it certainly knows how to be both. You might feel an urge to linebacker your way through the game and just kill everything as fast and as stylishly as possible, but that's not what Blasphemous wants you to do. It operates at a much slower pace pace than what it looks like. And whereas that's not really a good or bad thing, it did take me a while to get used to the conscious and careful approach the game enforces. Being aware of your own limitations is paramount to getting the most out of the platforming and the combat. And in order to know those limitations, there's really no way around just playing the game and getting a feel for what it demands from you. And that's not really something I'm a big fan of, because a large portion of my early deaths weren't from mistiming a repost or anything like that. No, it seemed like for the first couple areas I was just headbutting spikes or falling through floors or something because I didn't yet fully grasp how the platforming worked and what it expected from me as a player. Much like actual religious atonement, you just kinda spend a chunk of time suffering and dying and being ridiculed before things finally begin making sense and you actually start having fun, leading me to believe this game has either an exceptionally high self-awareness or extremely little. The whole sticking your sword into the wall to climb bit kinda took some getting used to, but it starts making quick sense when you successfully do it more than a couple times. The platforming, and for that matter, the enemy strength and combat difficulty in general seem to be much higher in some early areas of the game than others, despite the game being a non-linear platformer, which, you know, that's certainly not wrong. I mean, that is what it is, but that descriptor loses a huge bit of its meaning if a starting point is heavily encouraged. I was about 3 paragraphs deep into the rough draft of this review, and it had an entirely different tone than this one because I had myself thoroughly convinced the whole game just wanted to be this difficult, and I just wasn't good enough. Finally, after my frustration reached a certain threshold, I tried diving into the Mercy Dreams area. Enemy strength and platform difficulty was noticeably more lenient, the rewards for killing each enemy were much lower than before, and I was able to wipe the floor with the area boss in one go without even being somewhat prepared for it. And that's when it clicked. Oh, you wanted me to go here first. I'm fine with people describing Blasphemous as a non-linear platformer, and I guess I can't even really contest that label if you decide to. But if the difficulty spikes and learning curves are steep enough to make an entire part of the game close to inaccessible until you vacuumed out all the upgrades from the only other area currently available, well, it's not really non-linear then, is it? I mean, hell, I didn't know continually walking right would eventually lead me into a beginner's trap. Why would I instinctively gravitate towards the same direction you've pushed me in for the whole game so far? It's not like that's a precedent that's been around since Symphony of the fucking Night or anything. Let's be honest, that bit lasted way longer than you all even expected it to. But after all is said and accounted for, Blasphemous is still probably the most satisfying side-scroller I've played this year, and in that regard, bitterness might not be the best approach for this video. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's definitely done its job and then some in scratching my Silk Song itch at least, and for that I really do feel like some congratulations are in order, because that's not something a side-scroller has been able to do since, well, Hollow Knight. The non-linear platforming really does begin to kick in pretty thoroughly after that one segment, and eventually backtracking for items and opening paths and shortcuts to other parts of the game become more and more commonplace as you continue. There are these items called relics that give you special powers and resistances that you would need to traverse otherwise impassable gaps and obstacles, allowing you access to different and never before seen parts of the game. Each relic has its own quest that's just a little bit more drawn out than what feels appropriate, but this is also a means of incentivizing the player to backtrack and figure out what item is used to further each relic's questline. The 3 Gnarled Tongues relic, for instance, lets you climb vines and roots that you weren't able to before to access collectibles, rosary beads, prayers, sword hearts, moonlight children, and other key quest items. And if me running down the laundry list of the game's collectibles happened to confuse you, then yeah, that was my bad. I should probably get around to explaining what all that shit is at some point, so I might as well use this as a segue. A lot of the upgrades you find in Blasphemous are given to you in the form of one of these items. Prayers unlock special powers the player can use at the expense of one notch of their fervor meter, such as attacking quicker for a few seconds, summoning lightning, all that good stuff. Rosary beads provide smaller defense bonuses and resistances to certain elements, like lightning and fire. They're a much more common find than other buffs, but in going through the game multiple times now, I've come to realize there's really no upgrade system in the game more reliable than just spending your Tears of Atonement on permanent upgrades that are actually going to be worth your while. In doing so, you gain access to new melee combos and ranged attack options that feel slightly more powerful than they probably should. It's a good and reliable upgrade system that remains in lockstep with the game's increasing difficulty. Additionally, it actually makes you feel more powerful, which might make it one of my favorite upgrade systems I've seen in a side-scroller. It really is a sort of rags to riches upgrade system, insofar as you start the game feeling like your pathetic toothpick of a sword is going to break off at the hilt the moment you swing it at something that looks dense enough to do so, and by the time the end game kicks in, you basically become Saint Badass the Third, deflecting energy beams and summoning pillars of lightning from the palms of your hands and shit. There are also these rare upgrades known as sword hearts that give the player much more insane bonuses and buffs, usually at the expense of weakening something else about your character. These hearts are generally hidden behind complex platforming or challenging puzzles, and I spent the entire game trying to decide whether or not these things were even worth going out of your way to pick up. It's not that they're bad power-ups or anything, but they do a really piss-poor job at following their own rules. There's one, for example, that gives you the ability to refill your bile flask, and yes, that's what it's called, at the game-breaking, gut-punching expense of the power-up not activating that often. Okay, so it's basically just telling you, yeah, you can refill a healing flask on occasion, but don't depend on it? Is that really that big of a penalty though? It still gives you a bigger chance of having a health flask regenerate than you did before, which is an unimpressively flat 0. The drawback itself is just the power-up admitting that it's not as good as its function suggests. You can heal more often, but be careful, it's shittier than it sounds. What the hell kind of penalty is that? And if it sounds like I'm struggling to find anything bad about this game, then, well, yeah. I mean, the game has a few annoying drawbacks that take me out of the immersion, but everything in the game is designed seamlessly enough to be able to pull me back in pretty quickly. I guess I could complain about how some of the side quests seem a little too cryptic and drawn out, but that's less a review of the components of the game and more a commentary on my own ant-sized attention span. I guess I could point out that I really don't like how dialogue interactions are handled in the game. Due to my years of soulsing about, so to speak, I've come to just kinda expect that whenever you approach an NPC, dialogue just kind of flows naturally without any player input. Unless the player is given a chance to say anything in response, sure, but this isn't the case. The first time I tried talking to someone, I half convinced myself that my computer was just in the middle of a crash or something, before realizing I actually had to press a button just to let whoever I was talking to know they could move on to the next sentence. And having to press a button and manually push the conversation forward like that every time someone completes a thought, instead of just letting it play out naturally, is more tantalizing than I think it has to be. But on the other hand, the button you press to start conversations is different from the button you press to continue them, which eliminates that whole problem of impatiently button mashing through dialogue you've already heard 8 times and then having to dislodge your fist from your desk because you accidentally started the whole goddamn thing over again. So, I don't know, glad to see they thought of that, at least. But in certain interactions, starting the dialogue isn't even an option. If you're trying to buy a really important item from this vendor, for instance, each time you try to interact with an item, you get interrupted by a really intrusive dialogue prompt telling you how great the vendor's inventory is and that it's only the best you can find in Custodia. Could I maybe look at the item to verify that for myself, please? Wouldn't it make more sense to have the vendor's dialogue just play once automatically on entry and then leave me to peruse the inventory myself? Why is it necessary for me to hear the same 2 sentences every time I try to pick something up? And finally, I'd like to move into combing through something that really makes Blasphemous stand out amongst its side-scroller peers in my opinion. Namely, its grotesque but well-realized art style and the way that it can somehow arrange low-res clumps of pixels into something as tasteful and appetizing as an abnormally tall topless damsel being impaled through just about every square inch of her center mass. Yeah, this is PG rated. Or at least it's the closest I'm going to get to it at this rate, fuck. Blasphemous really does hit it out of the park on this one. And I think you could say that regardless of how strong your gag reflex is feeling. Because as visceral and as graphic as it is, if these sorts of visuals are what's flipping your stomach upside down, then that's really only a further testament of said visuals correctly doing their job. If the Book of Revelations looked like a giant gingerbread man house, all the sacrilegious motifs and theological dread wouldn't hit you nearly as hard as it does. If it's fire and brimstone we're dealing with here, you would in turn expect for everyone to look like they have skin made of week old regurgitated spaghetti. Like, it's hell on earth. It's supposed to make your stomach turn. It's not exactly aiming to resemble your downtown shopping mall or anything. Well, I don't know. Guess that kind of depends on the city you live in, though. There are more than a few side-scrollers and Metroidvanias that come to mind that use this sort of dark imagery to convey its atmosphere, but Blasphemous seems interested in pushing that envelope just a little further, and I'm honestly at a loss as to whether that's good or bad. Now, pardon me if this next sentence sounds a little muffled due to the poor acoustics of my head being jammed up my ass, but it really feels like the art might actually be a little too good. I mean, the combat and everything is fine, but it doesn't really do anything different. And I think that does it justice, because given the environment it's in, it doesn't really need to be. But the drawback of that is the combat now only feels like an accessory to how the game looks. Even way back since the trailers, the only thing about this game that was ever really given a spotlight was its blood and guts art style. And so even if it is executed with grade A, flying color, 5-star thumbs uppery or whatever the fuck, it's pretty easy to see that everything else was kind of meant to take the back seat to it. If the combat is the average middle school student whose biggest accomplishment is getting away with A's and B's every semester, then consider the art style the Oxford-bound child prodigy sitting next to him, forcing everyone else to work in his shadow. The combat may be good, and perhaps even great, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the game was designed with a very clear focus. The hyper-grotesque designs of the bosses I fought would only become more exciting and badass once I realized I actually got to fight it and kill it. I would leave a boss room so overwhelmed with this violence high after bathing myself in the blood of a 20-foot-tall walking face that I actually felt kind of bummed out when I figured out there weren't as many as I thought. The bosses became an instant highlight of the game for me, and that's what I mean by some things in this game being too good. The boss fights were so much of a highlight, in fact, that all the platforming and hacking and slashing I was doing in between those fights only felt anticlimactic. I mean, don't get me wrong, those parts of the game were still fun in my opinion, but it felt less like a traumatizing descent into Revelations and more like I was just marking stuff off on someone's to-do list. Blasphemous overall is a game that doesn't really do anything mechanically different, and I think that's because it doesn't really need to. I don't like quantifying games or anything, but the combat I'd say is a solid 8, and a fully realized one at that. The one facet of Blasphemous that actually does make it unique in my opinion is how it handles its stylized visuals and design. So in that regard, whether or not you like Blasphemous isn't going to depend on the combat or the storytelling. I think more than anything it's going to depend ultimately on the strength of your stomach, and well, maybe the nature of your family upbringing might play a part as well. But anyways, if you're someone that appreciates the game style, then you're likely going to be even more blown away by some of the game's ridiculously insane visual concepts. But on the flip side, if you're someone that fights their gag reflex over hearing words like intestines or church, then yeah, maybe skip this one. Thankfully though, I had the desensitizing pleasure of pretty much growing up on Dead Space and youth groups, which might be why my personal threshold of ew has remained at a comfortably stratospheric level. You're going to know in about 5 minutes whether or not you'll like the rest of the game, so it's at this point where I would recommend something I've never recommended before and actually take the time to look at other playthroughs of the game prior to making the decision if you think it would be your cup of blood, so to speak. If you do find yourself enjoying it, then yeah, there are definitely more than enough collectibles and backstory and ending options to keep you entertained for, I'd say, at least a couple weeks, depending on how immersed you actually get into the game. The lore is surprisingly more layered than what I was expecting. It's more than just your standard everything is fucked because I said so format of storytelling. There's actually some details behind the fucking, and the cause that ultimately led to said fuckedness. Yes, I do write my own scripts. Why do you ask?